the CHIPS Program Office and national security. To discuss, we have on Ben Schwartz, the former director for national security at the CHIPS Program Office, which manages a $39 billion grant program appropriated by the CHIPS and Science Act. Ben, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks, Jordan. It's sincerely great to be here. I've listened to a number of your podcasts, and it's been a really impressive performance thus far. I hope I don't screw up your track record here.
All right, Ben. So let's kick it off. Why does the CHIPS Program Office matter?
So it's really not an exaggeration to say that this is the most ambitious industrial policy program that the U.S. government has launched in more than a generation. And what I mean by industrial policy is the U.S. government acting to shape supply chains and the market for a major industry, in this instance, the semiconductor industry. This is a huge, huge change. It's not just that the U.S. is not like a communist country that's centrally planned. It's that the U.S. is also not like France. It's also not like Singapore. We don't have a long history of the central or federal government acting to use billions and billions of dollars in grants to make this kind of shift to part of the economy, the U.S. economy and the global economy. And to be candid, it's sort of anathema to traditional American cultural and political proclivities. A large government-administered grant program is just not the first choice, because when you do something like this, you have officials picking winners and losers. And the losers are always going to claim that they were treated unfairly, there was impropriety of some kind. And so it's just inevitable in industrial policy to get that. I also think that Americans just are not really as comfortable as maybe other people in having governments sort of get involved and help companies that are large and profitable and doing pretty well. And yet, in this instance, the alternative to a grant program like this would have been, and I don't think this is an exaggeration at all, it would have been the economic equivalent of unilateral disarmament. And the reason I use sort of a military sort of analogy here is because we are in a fierce competition to shape these supply chains, where semiconductors are built, and where sort of the components and design and all that stuff feeds into that with foreign governments. And the position of the U.S. government for decades had been more or less to sit back and let those foreign governments shape those global supply chains. The U.S. used to be the leader in semiconductor manufacturing in the 60s. Some call that our golden age. We basically did everything. But over time, we lost leadership, and we went from, the statistics that are typically used as shifting from 40 to 12% of global manufacturing. And then we ended up in a situation where we were producing exactly 0 leading edge chips. So that's a problem that transcends the individuals, market participants. That's a public problem. That's a collective action problem. That's a national security problem. In the last couple of years, it's not just that we haven't had this leading edge. We also have experienced the effects of having shortages in what's called the legacy or foundational chips. During the COVID pandemic, there was really acute shortages that affected the auto industry, and that had huge impacts on our economy. And by some estimates, the Chinese government just in the last couple of years have been adding something like 80% of new capacity in legacy chips. So we face a situation where the absence of U.S. government action here isn't sort of a neutral situation where free market forces determine where these supply chains are. No, foreign governments with their own incentives and companies acting sort of on a very understandable profit incentive that increase margins, lowest cost, highest margins, have resulted in a situation not only where the U.S. wasn't leading in semiconductor manufacturing, it's that there was extreme geographic concentration risk in terms of where this stuff was being produced. I think one number is 92% of all leading edge chips were in Taiwan. And so what we have here is a real issue, because if you lose access to those chips, it's not just going to affect a couple of consumers, it's going to affect the entire economy. I saw, I think this week, Gilman Louie, who's really a leading thinker in both the national security and in technology. I saw a quote that he said that if we lost access to those leading edge manufacturing capabilities, it could affect something like 10% of the global economy. So this is a major effort to sort of shape supply chains in a way that increases our resilience and helps alleviate a really acute national security risk.
So I'm completely bought in on the sort of strategic level of like the status quo not really being sustainable from an economic and national security perspective. But I guess, there are different paths that could have been taken at the operational level. There already was a big, tax and investment incentive baked into the CHIPS and Science Act. That could have just been the whole thing, and we wouldn't have had these like direct signing of all these deals with different different riders and demands attached to them to push the companies to do X as opposed to Y. So I'm really excited for the next hour or so to get your perspective in particular on, what actually having the CHIPS program office directly negotiating with all these companies did specifically for this question of national security.
So I think there's two answers, or two really critical components to answering that question. The first is that $39 billion may sound like a lot of money, but in a semiconductor industry where, it could be $30 billion for one fab, it actually is not a lot of money. And so you really need to be nuanced and creative in how you stretch that funding. And so we needed to basically negotiate and push companies in directions that they wouldn't otherwise go in just for a sort of a flat amount of funds. And I think the fact that there was candidly uncertainty about how much money companies would get and the timeline for when that would happen actually resulted in crowding in more private investment than would have been the case if there was just a single sort of straight tax deduction. The aspect of the negotiating, I think, probably resulted in crowding in a substantial amount more funding than otherwise would have been the case. And in terms of the numbers, the Semiconductor Industry Association came out with a figure, I think, in February of this year, in which they stated that they estimate that something like $264 billion had been crowded in since basically it was signaled that the CHIPS and Science Act would pass and that there would be this kind of a grant program. The White House website had a more ambitious figure. I think they had something like $640 billion in new investments associated with CHIPS. So I don't know, somewhere between those two numbers is a real number in the reality, but whatever it is, like that's a lot of money. And so despite the fact that there's different ways this could have gone down and the fact that we're still in the midst of a program, we do know that, there has been success. Like that's real money. It's a big figure. And I'd say it's also really important, like what that money represents tangibly. So the kind of investments we've gotten in the United States are themselves quite significant. So the $100 billion multi-state program that Intel is committed to is unlike anything we've seen in American history. I think, $65 billion commitment that TSMC has made, the leading, semiconductor company in the world, is the largest foreign investment we've ever seen. Samsung comes in shortly under that with $40 billion, the second leading edge company in the world, foreign company. We have seen Micron's investment of $75 billion for leading edge memory, and SK Hynix also announced their own investments in the United States. So those particular investments, forget the total figures, the fact that those companies are committing to what they're committing to doing here in the United States is also an unquestionable success of this program. That's unambiguous. There is no other country in the world that has the combination of that kind of technology and those companies all operating in the same space. And it's not clear to me that you would have gotten that kind of thing just from tax incentives. The second sort of answer to your question, why the negotiation is valuable, I'd say is the following. Companies very understandably are going to do whatever maximizes sort of their profitability. That's their fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders, which inherently means that sort of longer term resiliency questions about supply chains are not going to be the first thing that is considered, right? So if you just give a tax incentive, that will cut costs for a shortened period of time. But if there aren't hooks in that funding stream, if there aren't things that require an increased focus on resilience, then over time those companies are just going to default back to a situation where they're maximizing efficiencies rather than maximizing resiliency. And in this instance, the reason this is a national security problem is not because costs are too high. That's not the problem. The problem is that there's this severe geographic concentration risk. And that doesn't get solved with a flat tax. You actually need hooks into these agreements that keep companies focused on where this stuff is manufactured and what their supply chain looks like from a resiliency standpoint.
Yeah, a few things on that. I guess the counter arguments, right, are like, it took longer. So you had to actually do the negotiations, and that was, I mean, maybe they were sort of front running on their investments because they figured they'd get some money, but there was some delay involved in doing this. And also, I mean, you guys weren't free, right? It was probably like a 9-figure dollar amount with all the staff and lawyering and what have you. But point taken, Ben. I'm curious on the sort of, the maximizing efficiency, like they won't do the supply chain resilience stuff on their own. I mean, look, like CEOs read the news too. Was your sense that basically none of this sort of like resilience and onshoring stuff would have happened without the CHIPS Act, or was this kind of already in the air, and it felt more like pushing on open doors for these types of maybe less stripped down economical investments?
Yeah. So look, there's a spectrum of sensitivity to questions about resiliency among companies in this space, right? So I think companies, particularly those that are feeding the auto industry directly, probably have been more sensitive to the need for more resilient supply chains than some other segments of the industry, mostly because the auto industry experienced like very painful shortages and have told some of their suppliers that they actually need to diversify their footprint. So I know for a fact that there's greater sensitivity in that area. There are other parts of the supply chains that have not, it was shocking to hear from them how much they simply didn't care that they were exposed in certain parts of the world. So your question is, would nothing have happened? No. there would have been some, investments in the United States regardless of the CHIPS program. Would it been anything like the degree that we've seen? I'd also say absolutely not. Like this unquestionably had a significant impact in shaping where these projects were to be built. I have a sort of a humble view about the role of the U.S. government as a general matter in shaping the private industry. Humility in the sense that we need to be aware of the limits of what we know and understand about very complicated supply chains. And B, we have to be humble about the tools that we have available to actually shape those things, which are not nearly as powerful as I think some people in Washington assume they are. And yet, even with that sort of my own perspective, I think that we had really a significant impact here and will continue to have it as long as this program exists in shaping some behavior. Because look, if you're a CEO, you're focused maybe on the next 5 years, maybe 10 years, maybe. Your time horizon is just inherently shorter than what's really in the public interest. And this is something that I think is actually a fundamental issue in terms of the competition we face with the Chinese Communist Party. There is somebody in Beijing that has been focused on industrial policy for decades, right? And that person has time and the ability to really drill down on a subject and plan things that will impact the Chinese economy for a long period of time. That doesn't, that issue of time and focus is not something the U.S. political system really is in an advantage here in managing. We don't do that well. If we could plan 4 to 6 months ahead, that's great. But industrial policy really does require that focus on time and the ability to think in longer terms, which is why, candidly, industrial policy in the United States is only going to work if it's a bipartisan thing. The CHIPS and Science Act was a bipartisan thing. My hope and prayer, candidly, is it remains that because it's the only way that it's going to work over time.
In thinking about Taiwan contingencies, is it the case that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, or is maybe we can fix this in 15 or 20 years, however long your horizon is, but would it just be so bad anyways that it would be far too expensive to actually have something that can get you moderately up and running at the same level, and we should just like expect to go back to the early 2000s when it comes to microelectronics for for a number of years?
Yeah, so look, there's no risk elimination in this scenario. This is about risk mitigation, right? In terms of where we try to diversify the geographic footprint of critical manufacturing. And I will say that the way that I think about this is that it's much harder to go from 0 to 1 than go from 1 to 2 or 1 to 3 in terms of just capacity. So just having a foundation of, say, leading edge capability here in the United States, even if it's relatively small in terms of the global capacity, is still extremely valuable from a resiliency standpoint. I also think that there's a technology leadership factor as well, which is just having, advanced technology in the United States can create a virtuous cycle in terms of having people that need to be trained in the United States to sort of operate in those fabs, to have a research and development function. And one of the things I'm very proud of is that in some of these deals we've negotiated, it's multifaceted, right? So it creates these positive clusters that involve not just manufacturing, but leading edge R&D and supply chain clusters and things like that. So you get this like virtuous cycle of innovation and growth and whatnot. There's places for people to go work after they study and et cetera, et cetera. And so there's the resiliency question and factor about having capacity here, but there's also the technology leadership aspect of having advanced capabilities in the United States.
So, we've talked a little bit about the, why leading edge logic capability in the U.S. is something that's important and relevant over the long term. But more broadly, how did you guys conceptualize what national security meant in the context of the CHIPS Act's mandate?
Yeah. So this is a subject that doesn't get nearly as much attention as some other topics, but obviously I think it's important because it was the NatSec team, it was my team that was leading a lot of these efforts. So let me break it down into a couple of components. So I'd say that there's like 3 ways we thought about national security at least. The first is about the question of resiliency for supply chains that are critical to national security. So what does that mean? We used the Presidential Policy Directive 21 to help identify and to share with applicants what we mean by sort of supply chains critical to national security. These things deal with like aerospace and defense industries, transportation, electrical grid, things that basically are that affect the public writ large and don't just sort of decrease the cost of a personal electronics device for an individual consumer. So this is an area that is of greatest interest to the public, right? And so when we looked at project proposals, the first thing we asked is, okay, like if we increase capacity here in the United States for this, how is that going to feed these critical supply chains, or will it at all? A subcomponent of that, and one that we spent a lot of time on, is will it feed the defense industrial base, right? One of the things that's absolutely essential for our society to function is not just, a free economy and a functioning economy, but do we have the military capabilities to protect that economy? And in this day and age, that means that we need to make sure that the supply chains that feed things like the F-35 and the F-15 and other major weapon systems are not vulnerable to like disruption in parts of the world that, are vulnerable to disruption. And so one of the things that I'm especially proud about is our team was able to convince some of these applicants to onshore capabilities that were especially critical to those defense industrial base supply chains. And in some instances, introduce technologies that had just never actually been available to the DIB because sometimes you actually can't incorporate technologies manufactured abroad for security reasons into majorly sensitive programs. And now we're going to have those here in the United States. So that was one of the main ways that the national security team and CHIPS, contributed to the program. The second way that we contributed in a significant way was to make sure that these investments were reasonably protected from various types of threats. In the statute that authorized our program, it specifically called out things associated with what we call operational security. So like cybersecurity, the threats of counterfeits, concern about foreign influence and control of operations, and et cetera. And I was very privileged to work with a team of just absolute, superstars with the nerdiest but most critical knowledge of things like cybersecurity standards and how equipment communicates, semiconductor equipment communicates with the internet and outside systems, and how you structure corporate governance to make sure that, information that's sensitive doesn't leak out to foreign countries and things like that. So the second thing we did is we made sure we negotiated with these companies. We helped them really, evaluate and develop standards for securing their projects that I think is quite important to the overall security of these major investments. And then the third thing that the team focused on, and this was at the direction of Congress explicitly, was the guardrails implementation. So in Congress's infinite wisdom, they put in some fairly pointed language about preventing the expansion of capabilities in foreign entities of concern, foreign countries of concern, for companies that receive CHIPS grants. I think the point being that we don't want to inadvertently or even indirectly somehow advantage the development of technologies related to national security in a country like China or Iran. And so there's actually a lot of nuance in how you implement those things. It's actually quite complicated in interpreting that statute, applying it in a consistent way, and doing it in a way that maximizes national security and protects these projects, but also allows companies to remain commercially competitive and viable. So we spent a lot of time associated with implementing the guardrails. So, these things, the resiliency question, the operational security question, and the guardrails implementation are things that don't get a lot of press. But I think over time, as people study this program, more people will understand actually the critical importance of this work.
Well, I mean, come on, Ben. I think we wrote like 10,000 words about the CHIPS guardrails over the past few years. But let's pick up.
I forgot about the quality of your viewership, Jordan. I'm talking about anybody outside of the ChinaTalk show and outside of the Beltway is, I guess, what I was referencing there.
But no, let's pick up on some of that. So on number 2, it's just you talk about bringing the manufacturing here, but anything can be sucksnetted. I mean, we just had half of the American economy go offline because CrowdStrike has an idiot intern. It's one thing to have the manufacturing here, but on the other hand, these are not nuclear plants, right? These are not nuclear reactors. They have to have data going in and out of them. And I mean, I don't know if you can answer this. Is it even feasible?
Yes, there's a way of structuring and managing this problem.
Okay.
And this is the thing. I was privileged to serve with people who made it a profession of doing this. In prior jobs. I mean, the traditional way of managing this kind of thing is through threat is a function of, risk is a function of threat, vulnerability, and consequence. Again, risk equals threat, vulnerability, consequence. That is a typical formula that is used in the security community to break down what may seem like an unmanageable problem, which is operational security risk, into components and then address each of those components in a reasonable way. So, there's standards that exist for cybersecurity and other things, but there's also just the operational structure. You go to these facilities and you check out their physical security program, their insider threat program. You look at how they vet contractors. You look at what information is firewalled in terms of could leak out to, say, a foreign parent and things like that. So yeah, are we going to eliminate risk? No, of course now we're not going to eliminate risk, but you can minimize it, and you can minimize it with a focus on those things that are most consequential from a national security perspective.
I mean, it's a very different. I mean, particularly with the organizations who maybe haven't spent a lot of time dealing with the sort of Pentagon extended universe. I mean, was this a culture shock? Had these companies been thinking about this, or how did those exchanges go? You mentioned earlier that it was a lot of teaching on your end. you found?
Yeah, so again, it's a range. So there are some companies that have been serving the defense industrial base for a long period of time, and they have very robust protections in place. They might be part of the Trusted Foundry program, which is a program administered by the Department of Defense to ensure that, you know, classified and sensitive systems are fed with parts and semiconductors that are basically, you know, going through an advanced type of rigorous security structure. Then there are other companies that have never served the DIB, have and actually hadn't been interested in doing it really until we pushed them, because we had leverage, right? So companies, some of the most advanced technology, or the most advanced technology, comes from companies that get their margins purely in the commercial space. And when they look at the margins for working with the defense community, they think, like, why should we bother? But in our instance, we said, you should bother because this is a national security program, and you need to give a good justification why you should receive funding. And so they're like, okay, you know, we're willing to look at partnering with the defense community in a way we never have before. We're willing to look at creating operational security mechanisms that we wouldn't otherwise have done. So, and then there are companies that will probably never work with the DIB that we communicated with, that were just interested in increased security because they were aware of the vulnerabilities that exist for their commercial operations and just wanted to harden themselves, and had just, like, they were either smaller companies or they had gone through mergers and acquisitions and they didn't have uniform standards in place to govern their processes and procedures. And they welcomed the opportunity to just learn and about who to work with and who to partner within the U.S. government to improve their security.
Let's talk about the CHIPS guardrails. I mean, what were some of the decision points you guys had in implementing that provision?
I can't get into the particulars for individual companies, obviously. I think what I would say is that, you know, legislation is never sort of perfect in terms of its ability to be translated into clear programmatic decisions. In other words, like, there are categories of what semiconductor technologies are of national security importance that Congress sort of, like, used throughout in this legislation. And we've had to figure out, all right, how do we use those categories to comport with the increased complexity of how things actually work in the real world, right? So in other words, they're imperfect terms, they're imperfect categories, and we need to figure out, like, you know, how do we interpret that in a way that is, you know, true to the legislative intent, but also reflective of the complexities of the way companies actually operate. So that has been, you know, a challenge that we've had to deal with. Our objective on the national security side is not to basically kill projects here in the United States through non-commercial security standards, because that doesn't actually serve national security, right? Like, the least secure project, I told my team when I got there, is the one that doesn't exist, right?
So just for some context for folks, the CHIPS guardrails, basically what it did was say, if you're going to take CHIPS money, then there's some time horizon in which the U.S. government has a say in whether or not you invest directly into the PRC. And over that time period, like, if you do decide to build a plant or you know, some expansion or whatever of your footprint within China, then the CHIPS Program Office can come knocking for its money back. And that kind of back and forth was very relevant to a lot of these companies, because they do have fabs or manufacturing facilities or, you know, long supply chains which run through China. So I know Ben can't tell us just how it went down with them with Intel and Micron and SK, but maybe that'll come out in all my FOIA requests that I'm throwing into your guys' into the hopper over the coming months and years.
And just to put a finer point on it, there's the expansion clawback that deals with expanding capacity in foreign entities of concern. And then there's the joint technology and licensing clawback that deals with the nature of partnerships with foreign entities of concern. So we had to manage both of those requirements in the program.
Yeah. And, you know, there's been a lot of news about, like, Intel Capital and other sort of direct investments into startups. Those, like, that's not your problem. That's, like, the outbound investment screening folks' thing. Or was there any sort of interaction between the CHIPS guardrails folks and those discussions?
Yeah, I can't possibly get into commenting on anything that deals with a particular company that has not been made public for overdetermined reasons. But I'll just share that, like, obviously we read the news and are aware of the recent reports that that have come out on that topic.
All right.
And we listen to ChinaTalk as well, because how else would we stay informed about what's really happening?
Let's talk about some do you have like a baby over the course of this process? Like, what's one of your favorite deals that you think exemplifies why the CHIPS program office should exist in the first place?
Every single deal is its own unique snowflake. And actually, that's one of the things that makes this program really special, is that we were able to get, we were at least able to attempt to get the maximum bang for our buck with each applicant by negotiating with each of them in a highly particular way, right? To try to extract the most economic and national security out of these deals. I actually really liked one of the first deals we announced, which is the deal with BAE. It's like a very small deal. Like, it's not going to get a lot of attention over time. It's about a $35 million announcement for preliminary terms. And the reason I liked it is that it was like a very smart way of using U.S. government funding. Basically, BAE produces these things called monolithic microwave integrated circuits, MMICs. And it turns out that these things are absolutely essential to electronic warfare systems that go into things like the F-35 and F-15. It's also clear that, like, there had been a real backlog. Like, they could not produce enough of these things, and it was holding up, key components of these major defense programs. And you'd think, like, the Defense Department has a lot of money, like, they could figure out a way of solving this problem. But it turns out, money is allocated. There's colors of money in the government, blah, blah, blah. Like, by using CHIPS funds to support the expansion of capacity at this BAE facility, not only were we able to deal with, like, the backlogs for these MMICs, we're able actually to lower the overall cost of producing the MMICs because you had greater economies of scale. And so you're able to, one, eliminate the backlogs, create more resilience in something that is absolutely critical to sort of supply chains that affect national security, and doing it in a way that cut costs, right? So, like, this costs that, by the way, wouldn't be borne by, like, private consumers. Like, there's only, one consumer of these fighter aircraft for the most part, and that's the defense community that is paid for with your tax dollars. So, like, we were actually able to lower that's just a smart way of using government funding. So I like that deal. By the way, that's also, this facility is a trusted foundry, right? So it increases capacity at a foundry that's uniquely suited to create trusted microelectronics.
We couldn't have passed those costs on to Norway.
Theoretically, a lot is possible. In actual implementation, far less is doable.
But, I think this is an interesting one because it sort of gets at this, like, long tail of components and supply chain, which, it is impossible for one person to all have in their brain. And, one of the other strong arguments for the CHIPS program office is just, like, the fact of doing these negotiations and getting the companies to share their information about how they do their business gives you, not complete situational awareness, but something closer to it to better inform you to be able to, place these bets on different parts of the table. I'm curious, what was that process like for the team of having all of this new and novel data at your fingertips and trying to synthesize it?
Yeah, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that we probably compiled better information about parts of the microelectronics industry than exists in any one place on the planet as part of this program. Who knows if that's entirely true, but it's totally plausible in my view. And I'm not one that thinks, like, the government should just collect data for its own sake. Like, there needs to be a good reason why you're bringing this information together. But this is one of those instances where really there's a collective action problem, and, like, the government is the only entity that's really going to solve that, which is, how do you deal with the risks, the geopolitical risks of high concentration of supply chains that feed, parts of the country. You need somebody to, like, look at that holistically and not just on a quarterly sort of basis of how your profits are going to be affected by where you manufacture things. So, we basically tried to, and this again, we tried to get the best deal by looking at the finances of these companies to say like, what do we need to do to get you to build here in a sustainable way and not a penny more?
And I think the other thing is like, there's not going to be some centralized like data broker or registry that isn't the U.S. government that any of these companies would trust to talk about all these sort of commercial secrets.
Yeah, I mean, I worked in private industry as well. I'm also aware of the limits of what these companies are going to ultimately share with us. But we did. I think we did the best that was possible, and that dialogue is going to continue over time. And I do think it actually benefits these companies as well to think about to just the exchange about supply chain resiliency issues, right? There are multiplier effects where they say, hey, look, we basically have vulnerabilities where we have one provider, one supplier of something, and we'd love to see more than one option in this geographic location, and then we take that in. The U.S. government could take that into consideration in terms of how it allocates its resources.
Can you talk a little bit about the Defense Production Act survey and how that ended up also potentially feeding into some of the BIS export control stuff?
The CHIPS Program Office is not part of BIS, but we all work together in the sandbox. We play well with each other. And the Secretary Raimondo had come out publicly when that survey was released. And she was pretty direct in noting that, hey, like, industrial policy is a multivariable equation in the sense that if you want to have an output, which is, say, increased resiliency, there are multiple factors that will, affect that output. One of them is grants, right? Only one tool is grants. The other tools have to deal with trade restrictions or what we would call protecting from non-market behavior of other countries, right? If they're dumping things unfairly, if they're targeting certain technologies and industries through like non-market subsidies that will basically sustain non-competitive, manufacturing until alternative competitors go out of business. And we need to understand that. We need to understand, where these chips are coming from and what foreign governments may or may not be doing in that. And the survey is a tool that exists for the U.S. government to understand supply chains that affect national security. And obviously this is one of them. So, I think those kind of surveys are quite important. And I do think that like over time is, depending on what information is received and what we learn about foreign governments, these other tools in the U.S. government toolbox will be seriously considered to manage some of the risks. Candidly, the Chinese have a playbook in terms of how they can flood a market, right? And it's one of the things that makes the competition the U.S. faces with China really distinct. You'd say during the Cold War, Soviet Union controlled a large geographic area, centralized planning, very similar to today. But actually, one of the big differences is that the Soviet Union never really had the integration in the global economy where it had these exports that could really drive foreign companies out of business. The Chinese government has that ability. Like if they basically decide like they want to control certain technology, they can, and this gets back to that point about time and focus, right? They can say like, we're going to fund this thing for a very long period of time, drive the prices down to an area where like foreign companies can't produce, can't compete, and drive those things out of the market. We need to make sure that doesn't happen.
Legacy chips in particular, it's a tricky one. We're currently running an essay contest with Noah Smith and Chris Miller about the sort of menu of potential tools that the U.S. government has at its disposal to try to address the solar panel-esque onslaught, which is coming down the pipeline from Chinese legacy chips. And it's a tricky one, right? Because I don't know, you guys have already spent a lot of the money, but it does seem like you're going to have to bring a lot of different tools out of the toolbox to address it. Do you have any particularly clever ideas or pitches for one or another tool that you think would be particularly relevant in this case?
So, and this is unfortunately not a new statement. I wish it wasn't new. I wish this issue was resolved. But the one thing that has to be done is we got to have greater traceability and visibility into the supply chains, which gets to your point about the DPA survey, right? We can't really take effective action until we have a more granular understanding of where chips are produced, how they're integrated into manufacturing here and then in our supply chains. Because what we don't want to do is create a situation where we unintentionally make manufacturing uncompetitive in the United States by cutting out, the supply of chips that feed that manufacturing. So the first is visibility. We need better visibility. We need information from companies on that. We also need to have a dialogue with companies about how to effectively protect these markets from non-market behavior, right? So companies, I think, have been hesitant in part because maybe they don't have the information themselves. It takes money and time to understand where you're getting your chips from. And then I think we need to have a conversation where we're like, look, here are the outcomes we're trying to get to. How do we get there? And I'm not trying to be kumbaya here. It's just that there's an information gap. And if the U.S. government takes action, the U.S. government tends to be a blunt instrument. It doesn't always do nuance very well. And these are highly complicated markets. And so if the U.S. takes a blunt force approach, we could end up being counterproductive to our own ends. The other thing is in terms of the tools, there's 301 investigations, 232 tools, there's IEPA, there's the 5949. I'm just throwing out Washington stuff that will mean nothing to most people, although your listeners are very well informed. But at the end of the day, this all gets back to trade controls, right? Restricting the import of things that are basically being produced for political reasons. I mean, that's the distinction I think is really important. The U.S. is a market economy. Most of the world, we operate as a market economy. But there are certain governments that use market dynamics for political end states. Their goal is not to create self-sustaining industries. It's to control technologies so that they have leverage in political and even military contingencies. And that's where trade barriers come in. And that's where, you have to protect the country from that kind of a threat.
Is there any Monday morning quarterbacking you want to do here?
Look, no program is run perfectly, but I've worked in many different federal agencies. I worked at the State Department. I've worked at the Energy Department. I spent a lot of years at the Defense Department. I worked in the intelligence community. I've worked in private industry, consultant, nonprofits. And I say that only to underscore that when I say that I've never been as impressed with the public servants I've worked with in this program, it should mean something. That's an informed opinion. It's not just sort of the guy that just left saying nice things about his prior colleagues. This is a really, a professor of mine compared it to the Manhattan Project in terms of pulling talent from private sector and from other parts of the government together to do something in a short period of time that's critical to the country. And I think that the most important lesson here is that there's limits to what you can get done in a short period of time when you're trying to do something of this magnitude. And so you really need, as I said before, that bipartisan support to allow the longevity that's necessary to achieve the successes you want, right? If a program like CHIPS were to get politicized, which, this town politicizes stuff that should be completely non-controversial, but it's easy to industrial policy is the easiest thing to politicize because it involves trade-offs. Every decision that you make involves some level of trade-offs. And so it's the easiest thing to rip apart if you want to politicize it. But the thing about that is it doesn't hurt the people that were making these decisions in the CHIPS program. These guys and gals, these are amazingly, they're going to go find jobs and do interesting stuff regardless of what happens with this program. It just hurts the country, right? It basically just hurts our ability to compete with China and others. And so the lesson is if we're going to endeavor to do things of this magnitude, which as I said before, I think we absolutely have to, it has to be a strongly bipartisan program. And it has to think of itself as a longer term initiative. So I think that's one of the lessons. I think the second lesson is just that, grants are just one tool in that toolbox we talked about. And you have to integrate that tool with other tools that the U.S. government has available that are, deal with trade barriers and countervailing duties and all that other stuff. The U.S. government is not really organized in a way to do industrial policy is say we're organized to do monetary policy. Like the Fed was designed, we have an institution to do monetary policy that has done very well over time. It's also typically been generally non-political, and it's been bipartisan, and it's been very effective because of that. It was designed that way, and it's institutionalized. We haven't institutionalized things for industrial policy on, like the CHIPS Act in that way, and that may be something that's really required.
A lot to pick up on there. Let's start with the bipartisan stuff. I mean, you guys had like one tricky news cycle with the daycare and whatnot. But it is remarkable to me just how much this has stayed out of that maelstrom, and whether that means we get more billion-dollar industrial policy pushes in the future or not, it like remains to be seen. But I think it is a testament to like the work you guys did and how, for the most part, the sort of politicals who maybe were focused on other things besides national and economic security, defined in a very anodyne way, would be able to understand that this is like a special thing which shouldn't necessarily be leveraged to pursue other domestic policy goals. On the sort of like Manhattan Project talent concentration perspective, you've mentioned a lot of other organizations you've worked with. What was it? I mean, were people excited about it? I know you guys had the special hiring authorities. What were the sort of ingredients to get the right team in place?
Yeah, so you already named one of them. This stuff is really fundamentally about people at the end of the day. And we were able, the leadership shown by Secretary Raimondo, I just haven't seen anywhere else in my time in DC, like sincerely. And I've supported directly of over a half a dozen cabinet secretaries in different jobs. Her direct leadership in getting this thing up and running. And the fact that like she's a cabinet secretary that was working for a president in which this was a priority. Like, it was a priority. We didn't.
Can you stay on that? Like, why do cabinet secretaries matter?
Well, I mean, because when they say get something done, there's a system in place to sort of compel people to do things. Like when you're a mid-level bureaucrat in a system, it's much harder to get that done. And most programs in the U.S. government are run by sort of mid-level. And so like, because the authorities and the responsibilities of a cabinet secretary are vast. So if they're going to, so their attention and focus gets diffused among the vastness of things they do, right? So you can only focus so much on any given thing. This was a priority. The second thing you noted is like the direct hiring authority, right? The ability to hire like quality people. For whatever, I don't know about myself, but like we didn't have to go through some of the wickets that typically, we'll say, dilute the quality of the people that come into these jobs. So that was absolutely essential. And I do think like the bipartisan aspect of things, like, right? Like that was also instrumental in this whole thing. So, there's nowhere else that I've sort of seen that in my experience in government.
So sorry, with the secretary, give me like an example of like a roadblock that she could clear that, if Ben was the highest ranking person running the show, he wouldn't be able to.
I mean, just the ability to engage the leadership of companies, the ability to engage the White House, the ability, like the thing about CHIPS as well is like, we had dependencies outside of the Commerce Department. In other words, like other agencies needed to do things or not do things for us to be successful, which is horrible in government. You never want dependencies in other agencies because it's like a tribal confederacy. Like you have your imperative, they have their imperatives. Like they're not necessarily going to do what you want just because you're part of the same government. Like it's hard herding cats. But when you have the senior level leadership, like, they can make a call to another cabinet official and just say like, you need to like, please resolve this by the end of the week. Right. And like things get done. So, that's I imagine actually that's not that dissimilar from certain companies as well in the private sector. Where just like, if you have the CEO engaged in something, it's going to work a little differently than if it's just sort of like a VP.
Let's come back to this idea of like institutionalizing the like industrial policy muscle. And I love that Fed analogy. and this is also one that has come up a number of times in the past on ChinaTalk when thinking about sort of China analysis or, net tech assessment, where, I'm so jealous of these macroeconomists. They have 400 PhDs just like sitting there having a good time, like clocking in at 9, clocking out at 5. Whereas, the sort of expertise on a lot of these other things, as you said, Ben, you got great people, but it was very much cobbled together from all these sort of like diffuse places in, coming from tech firms and investment banks and various corners of the deep state. What's your bill to build the industrial policy muscle?
So I'd say there's at least two things that are really important to that. One is that you create organizational structure that is designed to achieve specific purposes. So what I mean is like, if you're trying to solve for a particular problem, you make sure that that organization has all of the authorities and resources that are necessary to solve that problem. In terms of industrial policy, like that is dispersed amongst multiple agencies in the U.S. government. So you have USTR, you have the Treasury Department, you have different parts of commerce that each have their own thing. And like who like centralizes and like manages all those tools in a way that you could actually build something effectively? Maybe the NSC, maybe the National Economic Council, maybe a couple of strong leaders that just assert themselves and try to like herd the cats. That's not a great way, candidly, to do things. Like you should design a structure that is tailor-made to serve a specific purpose, right? So one is that. The second thing is about the people. And this is not like new, right? Like there are countries that have set up like systems to effectively do industrial policy. Like, I don't know, I just think of Singapore, right? They have a civil service that is highly meritocratic. They pay their people well. The standards are rigorous. So if if you screw up, there's consequences, right? So the reward is decent and the consequences are bad. And so it keeps quality people in these jobs and they don't necessarily go to the private sector because there's something to be gained for them over time so you need a personnel system that is sustainable and rewards talent.
I was reading Project 2025 as one does last night. And
is that something true? Is that something that one does or just like a few people in DC?
I have a disease, okay? I have a disease. And the Commerce Department chapter, it was interesting because on the one hand, it was like, yeah, we need to blow this up. But there was a part of it which was like, by the way, like we should do a lot of reorganization. Like commerce really doesn't make sense in how its various sort of authorities are like spread out in different places. And this guy's solution was to put a lot of stuff in USTR. But regardless, it seems like the Commerce Department is ripe for some, slightly more fundamental restructuring of like what it can and can't do. Because we're, historically, it has been this like big, just like weird agglomeration of different powers, which I would vote in favor of getting more of the tools for well, I don't know. Do you think it should just like swallow up USTR? It's kind of weird. USTR is its own thing.
I opened that report and started reading and then decided that my time was better spent with my children. So I put it down and I actually don't know what is in that report. I will say, and actually this gets back to the question you asked about why CHIPS was like successful. In addition to the secretary's leadership and it being a priority for the White House and bipartisan, the other thing that I should have mentioned is that we didn't inherit an organizational structure that was designed for some prior purpose.
Yeah.
Like we built the system that was designed for this specific mission, right? Which was challenging because we're building the plane as we're flying it, but it was also liberating because we basically could create these huge efficiencies. Most of government, right, the way it was set up was for some prior reflected some history. Something in the past is the reason it exists as it does in the present, which doesn't necessarily solve the thing we're trying to deal with in the future. So, like obviously, organizational structures should be revised over time. And, I don't know what the answer is on that in terms of commerce or USTR at this point. But it's, in my experience, one of the things that's most important in any institutions is that you have an alignment of responsibility and authority. And what I mean by that is if you're responsible for something, you should have the authorities necessary to meet that responsibility. Those authorities shouldn't exist or be like somebody else has them, and therefore you can never accomplish the thing you're responsible for accomplishing.
So the only other people I've come across in government who've had like as I guess positive reflections on their time as you're sharing today, Ben, are the folks who are in the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau in its early years before it got politicized and like completely blew up. And I think part of what you're saying is it's not surprising that that was also an organization which, was created to do its purpose and had special hiring authorities to bring on people it wanted. There's this Jefferson quote, "The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants." Maybe the tree of liberty also needs to be refreshed from time to time with the, hollowed out husks of like bureaus whose his window has closed or something. It's been a really long time since a Nichols Goldwater, a hard look at sort of bureaucratic structure and organization and like where the powers are and whatever. And maybe just Congress is like too much of a mess to take on something like this. But if we are in this age of national competition, like you think you might want to do one thing or another to account for the fact that, as you said, this is not the 1960s and 1970s. China is a very different beast than the Soviet Union, and maybe you gotta sort of like rejigger things a little bit from a bureaucratic perspective to appropriately respond to
that. My graduate education I did alongside some very distinguished military leaders, and one of them wrote a long essay called "Perpetual Adaptation." And this is somebody with very serious operational experiences in some of the most complex war zones in the world. And basically his point was that the militaries that succeed are those that are able to adapt more rapidly than their adversaries. And I think that's a lesson that's not particular to military dynamics, but actually is much more universal. And it certainly is important and applicable to bureaucracies. You need stability to allow you to, basically complete something and to be focused on the future and sort of have some predictability. But you also need the ability to shift, to adapt to changes in the situation, right? And government is not always as incented to do that as, say, the private industry. If you don't adapt in a lot of private industries, like you die, right? Not in everyone, not if you're certain too big to fail companies. But government, but government doesn't have that imperative. And so it sometimes takes, real leadership and top down and whatnot to make that happen. And if you don't over time, then you get a blow up, right? Like if basically the cyclicality of things is like, if you don't get evolution, you get revolution, right? That's how things work. And, revolution is, as you said, often bloody.
Ben, you got a song to take us out on?
So I did start a meeting with one of the larger companies, a negotiation where they had submitted a bunch of requests. I said, the theme of this meeting is from the Rolling Stones. You can't always get what you want, but you might just find that you get what you need. And I would say that the meeting proceeded as such. So hopefully we'll get what we need here in Washington on chips and with everything else.
Thanks so much for being a part of ChinaTalk.